everyone, welcome back to my channel. I'm Huck. Today we are talking about my summer DNFs, so the books that I started and decided not to finish in June, July, and August. So I have 10 books to talk to you about today, and they're actually only from June and July. I didn't have any DNFs in August, which is probably because I was reading so little in August, but let's get started. Also, some of these I'm going to talk about pretty briefly just because I have reading vlogs that were my Will I DNF It vlogs where I was trying to find out if I was going to DNF these books. Some of them I did, some of them I didn't. So I'll link those below if you want to find out more detail about my reading experience, process, why I DNF'd them. But I'm going to be pretty brief in this video because I already talked about these a lot. So the first one that I have is The Game of Kings by Dorothy Dunnett. This is historical fiction that I mostly just really didn't enjoy the writing style of this. So I had a hard time getting into the story and characters because it just felt like such a slog to like get through like even a couple of pages of reading this. I just really didn't like the writing. The next is The Dark Tide by Alicia Jasinska, which is a YA fantasy that this had kind of an opposite problem in that the writing in this was so simplistic and bland that it was just really, it was very easy to read, but really boring to read. I also really didn't like her characterization. It felt very shallow. Character motivations didn't really make sense. Like the things that they did didn't make sense. It just wasn't like very well developed or thought out in general. Then we have The Gilded Wolves by Rashni Chokshi, which I almost finished. This is another YA fantasy. This is more like historical fantasy. And it's kind of a heist, and it has a band of friends and like a lot of things about it that I like. But at one point I was trying to look up something very specific from this and accidentally spoiled myself for something that happens in the book. And most of the time, spoilers don't bother me too much. Like, I don't necessarily love spoilers, but it wouldn't necessarily stop me from reading a book if I found out a spoiler, but it was something that I was like, oh, if this is what happens, I don't want to read this book. And so that's why I DNF'd it. Then we have Master of Crows by Grace Draven. This is a fantasy romance that I think I've learned that Grace Draven is just not the author for me. It had like a really interesting premise, but I didn't like either of the main characters. I didn't like their dynamic or romance. I didn't feel a connection or chemistry between them. It used some romance tropes that I personally just don't enjoy that much. It just like didn't do anything for me. And then the last one from this series of videos, I think I did 2 of them, so it's a 2 video series so far, but is Or What You Will by Jo Walton. This is a book about books that's following an author and one of her creations. And this did a few things that I have learned I specifically don't like in books about books. I'm very picky about them, which I learned eventually. But for one thing, it breaks the fourth wall and talks directly to you as the reader and is very self-aware in that way. That's just not a thing that I enjoy. It does a lot of like referencing other history and especially other like literature and books, which is not the type of, I like books that are about storytelling, not about like referencing specific books or literature. You know, it just was doing things that I wasn't really enjoying, and even the parts that were just about the author's life and like her as a character were just really boring. So, not a fan of that. Okay, so those were the books that were included in my Will I DNF It vlogs. Then I have a few more books that were just DNF'd for other various reasons. So, first up we have The Gossamer Mage by Julie E. Zernetta. This is a fantasy that is set in a world where people have this like goddess of death that they worship, and there's a kind of magic that involves like scribes, and somehow it's like a written type of magic, which all sounds really cool, but I just, for the life of me, could not get into this book. Like I would get like 10-20 pages into it and just completely zone out, and like I couldn't get past like 20-25 pages of this book. I don't know why. Then we have Master of Poisons by Andrea Hairston, which, first of all, has such a beautiful cover. I really wish that I had loved this because I love this cover so much. But I think that what I have learned, what I guess I already kind of knew, but I'm learning again. Sometimes I learn things and then forget them, and then I'm like, oh yeah, I should have remembered that. So does it count as learning if you forgot it? I don't know. That's not the point. Anyways, what this brought back to my mind is that I don't really enjoy apocalyptic stories. In general, I just don't like anything that has to do with apocalypses. Post-apocalyptic is a little bit better, but like current apocalyptic, like it is happening, it is like during the apocalypse of some kind, whether it's a dramatic one or not, like I just not super into it. And this is taking place during kind of like an environmental apocalypse, because there is this desert that is kind of slowly taking over and destroying all of the other land, and they're trying to like figure out what's happening. And so it's just not a thing that I enjoy. And this has reminded me of that, and someday I'm gonna remember it and stop buying apocalyptic books. Alright, so then I also DNF'd Peter Darling by Austen Chant, which is a novella fantasy retelling of Peter Pan, which is another one that's like, I know this about myself and yet I keep picking up these books, which is that I don't enjoy Peter Pan retellings. I don't enjoy Peter Pan just as a story in general, and I don't really like Peter Pan retellings. And yet this year alone, I have picked up 4 of them and I've DNF'd 3. Yeah, so that's pretty much it. I just don't like Peter Pan that much. It's very hard to win me over with a Peter Pan retelling. Then I also DNF'd The Roommate by Rosie Danan, which is a adult contemporary romance, which is about these 2 people who accidentally become roommates, and I think the guy is a porn star and the girl is like very uptight, and then, you know, drama ensues from that kind of thing. And this one, it just like, there was something about it that was like too tropey. With romances, I'm still figuring out what I like in contemporary romance because I'm very new to the genre. But there's a certain amount that like a lot of romances are pretty tropey, and like that's part of the fun. But there is a point where it like crosses a line and is like too much. And this one was just like too extreme in its tropes about how like she was so uptight and so bashful and so this and so that, and he's gonna like make her loosen up and like all of this stuff, that like that's a trope that I have read before and enjoyed, but it has to be like a little more subtle for me to enjoy it. So this one was just like a little much for me. And then the final book that I DNF'd was Half Sick of Shadows by Laura Sebastian, which I think this is probably the one that I have the most thoughts about. So far, this DNF video has been pretty like rapid fire, but this is a adult kind of historical fantasy Arthurian retelling from the perspective of the Lady of Shalott. It definitely takes a lot of liberties with the story and like the character dynamics and stuff, but my main problems with this, I think there are some things about this that are just like a me thing with my preferences about books and stuff, and some things that I'm like, I just don't think this is very well done. So like certain things that are like a me problem is that I'm very picky about Arthurian retellings in general. I actually don't super enjoy stories that are directly about like King Arthur, Lancelot, Guinevere, like that little love triangle. I find them really annoying. And so I like things that are more Arthurian adjacent, that are in the same setting and time period, but not directly about those 3 characters. I was hoping that because this is from the perspective of the Lady of Shalott, that it would be more about her and less about them, but it is actually very much about King Arthur and Guinevere and Lancelot, and like she's friends with them and they're very much a part of the story. So like that's you know, that's a me thing, that I just don't enjoy those characters. Things that I just did not think were very well done about this was, I think that the writing was very inconsistent. There were some periods where it was very like written in a very lovely way that I really enjoyed. The first page of the book I really liked, and it made me very excited to read the rest of it, but it really came and went, and sometimes the writing was very bland and sometimes it was very nice and atmospheric, but mostly not. And I just find that really frustrating when there's that like inconsistency in writing. The timeline of this book was also, I think, done in a way that I found really frustrating, because it is told, there's a present timeline, there are also a lot of flashbacks, and then there are also premonitions of the future, because our main character is a seer. And so we kind of have like all of these interspersed with one another, and a lot of times I actually really enjoy nonlinear storytelling. I don't mind flashbacks and all kinds of things like that. I just don't feel like it was done effectively in this. I generally just kind of found it confusing and distracting. I also had some issues with the setting and atmosphere and time period, I guess, because the thing is, like, I am not someone who's a stickler for historical accuracy, because most of the time I don't even know. Like, I'm not a history person, so it's not like I really like know that much about whether things are historically accurate. But there's a point where it's just like so clearly not accurate that I find, even I can find it frustrating. And in a lot of fantasy books, that's not an issue because they're fantasy, it's a made-up world, but this is an Arthurian retelling, and King Arthur is set in a very specific time and place. And unless she is like specifically setting it somewhere else or setting it in a fantasy world, I have at least a small amount of expectation of like a very small amount of like historical context for it. I'm not expecting it to be like hyper historically accurate, but just like a little bit. Like, I want to feel like you tried. But I did not get that feeling from this. And not being historically accurate is not like the worst thing in the world to me. The problem for me is that it was also just so bland in the setting, and it just, there wasn't much to it that felt distinct or unique to this place, or particularly like atmospheric, or just anything that set it apart. It felt like a million other also bland fantasy books that I have read and disliked. There wasn't anything about it that made it feel, even just in atmosphere, like Camelot. It really was only like Arthurian in name. It wasn't really in like the setting or the atmosphere or even like the character dynamics or really anything. Granted, I didn't read the entire book, but still. It just was so bland. And you know, I do get frustrated when characters are kind of overly modern in a medieval setting. And I'm not saying that they have to be like perfectly historically accurate in this, because like it's fantasy to some degree. Like, it's kind of historical fantasy-ish. But there's like a certain amount where it like becomes too modern that I find it annoying. And these characters, the way that they spoke and acted and dressed and like all of these things felt very modern, and also just didn't match the setting and didn't match the way the world was described. Like, there are certain things that would happen where they would explain to you how this world works that was a more old-fashioned way for the world to work. Characters would then act in a way that is counter to that and is much more modern, and then they would have no consequences for acting counter to the norms of this world, even if we're assuming it's a completely like removed fantasy world. And just the fact that it doesn't match and there were no consequences for things, like, it bothered me so much, and it makes it end up feeling less like a fully realized world with living characters and more like modern people wearing prom dresses at the Renaissance Festival. It just, I don't know. I just found this really annoying and I did not enjoy it, which is why I DNF'd it. All right, so those are all of the books that I DNF'd in the summer. Let me know if you DNF'd anything in the summer. I know not everyone does DNF, but I'd love to know if there's anything that you just were like, you know what, I can't take it, I have to DNF this book. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and until next time, bye!